Okay, good evening, colleagues. Welcome to the January Forum meeting. I'm just going to borrow Isabel's agenda. The first item of the agenda is the appointment of the chair, which we'll take towards the end of the meeting. Apologies for absences. I think Kimberly Herring, the academies, Mia Pye from high schools, Erin Woolley, Andrew Steed, Pete Broadbent, Jeremy Hannay and Jonathan Bailey have sent apologies. There's been no more since. No? Okay. And any urgent matters be considered? No? Matters to be considered in private? No? Declarations of interest? No. And the minutes of the November meeting. So, page 1. Page 2. Page 3. 4. 5. 6. And 7. No comments? Okay, great. We'll accept those as a record of the November meeting. Thank you to Isabel, who is our new administrator for Forum. Okay, so we'll move on to the main body of the meeting, which is schools forum report. So I'll hand over to Kim and Tamara.
Yes, there was just the membership item, but I don't think there's on page 11 and 12 of the report, there's the current membership list. I think it's as it was at the previous meeting with the new members on there.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so the main report starts on page 13 of the bundle pack. So the purpose of the forum meeting today, the key items are to advise the schools forum on the early years schools, high needs and central schools services blocks for the 25-26 financial year, consult on the early years funding formula and seek approval from the forum for the early years centrally retained funding elements, advise the school forum of the proposed schools block formula and indicative allocations, and to seek approval from the forum for the allocation of the remaining centrally retained funding following confirmation of the block allocation. So starting with recommending the early years block, the first three recommendations are around the early years block. So recommendation 1, to note the early years consultation feedback. Recommendation 2 is to agree the centrally retained level of the early years block at the maximum 4% as permitted by the regulations. And recommendation 3 is to note and comment on the proposed use of the early years block and the proposed rates and structure of the funding formula. So I'm going to hand over to Helen to take us through this section of the report.
Thank you. So starting at point 3, the early years funding consultation. So the consultation was open between the 10th of the 12th to the 10th of the 1st, 25. 3 events were held for providers, with 27 providers booked to attend. The consultation took place during that period so that we were ready for the schools forum report, which is due in early January. 15 providers responded to the consultation via Teams survey link, and 12 providers returned written responses. So for the Ealing's local formula proposals, 87% agreed, with 13% disagree. And for the support the proposals to retain 4%, 93% agreed, with 7% disagree, and for the proposal of allocating the 6.19% of the early years block, 87% agreed, with 13 disagreed. Any questions on the survey or? Okay, so moving on to point 6, early years block. So all children in England and Wales are entitled to the 15 hours of free nursery education per week, as you'll be aware, for 38 weeks a year from the term after their 3rd birthday until they reach statutory school age. Parents may choose to take this up in a maintained school, nursery, or in a private, voluntary or independent sector, early years setting, or with a childminder. Government extended the free entitlement to nursery childcare for 15 to 30 hours per week for working parents in September 2017. The aim was to reduce the cost of childcare for working families and break down the barriers to work. Currently, the early years block element within the dedicated schools grant funds the universal and extended provisions for all 3 and 4-year-old children, and the early years provision for disadvantaged and working family 2-year-old children. Funding is also currently used to support the cost of children with emerging levels of special educational needs and children in need of places for under 5 years in order to meet the council's statutory duty in this area. So you've got a table here, table 1, that summarises extending early entitlements for working families. Any questions?
Can I just kind of clarify that funding thing just very quickly? So the offer was extended to 2-year-olds. Mm-hmm. So if you have the old provision for 3-year-olds was a term after their 3rd birthday. So if you're a primary school with a nursery that starts when the children are 3 years old, but they qualify for the funding from 2 years old, if their children start with us the minute they're 3, would the funding be released to the school rather than waiting till the term after their 3rd birthday?
Yes.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, if you claim for the 2-year-old funding and they meet the 2-year-old funding criteria, yeah.
Sorry, so you'd still claim under the 2-year-old funding criteria until they're 3 years in a term. You use the 2-year-old funding criteria to claim. Yeah. Do all schools know about that?
I'm working my way around them, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Then moving to point 10, early years budget grant for 24-25. This was one-off to be given to providers. This had 100% pass-through. In financial year 25-26, the funding in respect of the September 2024 Teachers' Pay Award has been rolled into the early years block formula and included local authorities' hour rates for 3 and 4-year-olds and in maintained schools. Moving on to, sorry, apologies.
Increase did that, so it was built into the hourly rate. How much did it go up in percentage terms roughly as a result of that one-off grant? Is that something you know? Just
the early years budget grant. So no, the early years budget grant came into Ealing and went straight out. That was 100 pass back.
So how was it allocated out?
So it was awarded on the January 2024 census. So if the provider had registered a 3 or 4-year-old, whether any G funded or exactly right. So the DFE assessed.
Setting as a
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and for 25-26, what it's saying is that that's wrapped in with the rate of increase. So in the proposed base rates that are set out on start of, what is it, end of page 17, start of page 18, that proposed increase. So it's 25 to 26p for the 3 and 4-year-old and 2-year-olds, and 35p for the under 2-year-olds, the proposed increase. So that's inclusive of the additional funding that was wrapped in for last year's pay award and the uplift for this year, and which is a small uplift on top of that. So a lot of that increase is related to sort of the previous year pay award funding that was wrapped in.
Moving on to the national funding formula guidance updates for 25-26. So the key points on this is that local authorities have been required to allocate 95% of the funding to providers since 2018-19. This has changed this year, and local authorities are now required to allocate 96% of funding received through the early years block to providers. Government requires local authorities to set up inclusion funds to support children with additional needs. The formula requires using a single base rate for all providers, regardless of sector. The formula may have a fixed number of supplements in addition to the required deprivation factor. There is a cap on these supplements of 12% of the total allocation to providers. Maintained nurseries are financially protected under the national proposals in order to minimise disruption to support this. The government have been providing supplementary funding for maintained nursery schools. This means additional funding will be allocated to nursery schools outside of the main early years formulation allocation. So the changes to the operational guidance announced at the end of November 24 were made to support the introduction of the new entitlement rollouts, which included further guidance was issued around SENIF funding, which included all children. Part of all entitlements must have access to special educational needs inclusion funds for all children with emerging special educational needs under statutory school age, extending eligibility for early years pupil premium and disability access funding to eligible children under 2 years and under accessing the entitlements. The proposed funding formula is set out in Table 2. You've got your central spend of 4% allowance, early years inclusion fund, all entitlements 3, 4, 2-year-old and under 2, contingency, and the early years pupil premium, disability access funding, maintain nursery school supplements. Okay. So Ealing recognises the current difficult climate that many of our early years providers have faced and the importance of continuing to offer a stable funding rates and continue with high levels of inclusion support at a time that has been most testing for our provisions, ensuring a fair and equitable offer which meets the needs of Ealing's children. In order to continue with this, the local authority proposes fund rates for 25-26 that's set out in the Table 3. And continues. That proposes to continue with the allocating 100% pass-through for the following entitlements of funding for children's settings that meet the eligibility criteria, which are funding streams outside the main grant. For the DAF, disability access funding, the early years pupil premium and the maintained nursery supplement. The supplementary funding on 3- and 4-year-old and 2-year-old offer. So providers that attended the consultation events and those that completed the feedback form agreed with the principles of the supplementary funding in both the 3- and 4-year-old and 2-year-old funding streams. Feedback from one provider did comment that they felt that the base rate is low and does not reflect the increased cost in business. There was also mentioned that the quality supplement should be higher to compensate for higher wage costs. However, the overall majority of respondents agreed with the proposals.
So does anyone have any comments on the proposed structure of the funding formula before we move on to the centrally retained expenditure and the decision around that? No? Okay.
Okay, so moving on to the central expenditure. This is set out for in Table 4. We've got the Family Information Service, Early Years Quality Improvement Consultancy Offer, Central Services for Early Years Supporting High Needs Administration, Service Planning, Management, Business Support and Overheads including IT contract and systems management, and project support for the expansion for entitlements rollout. Of the providers that had responded to the consultation, and this was at the point of the 20th of December, only one felt that the pass-through rate should be 100%. The rest agreed with the proposed rate of 96%. Providers vocalised that they are aware of the cost involved in delivering the funding programme to children in Ealing and acknowledged that to ensure the continuity of the support, the allocation of centrally retained funding amounts would meet the required need. Providers have seen the increased numbers of families that are now eligible for early years funding and recognise that this has had an impact on the central services that support them. It's proposed that the forum members agree to the central retained level of early years block at 4% as permitted by the regulations.
Okay, so that's a decision for the forum, so it probably makes sense to take that decision and then move on to the conversation about the inclusion block afterwards.
Can I just ask a question about which categories of funding are the total out of which 4% is sustained? I was trying to taken out for the allowance, because on the previous table it adds up to 51.35. Is it everything except the 1.97? So it's the 4% is the early years inclusion fund, all entitlements, contingency, and whatever.
Yeah, so the only elements that are 100% pass through are the early years pupil premium, disability access funding, and the maintained nursery school supplement. So they're 100% pass through, and then the 4% relates to the remainder of the
so that's 4% of the all the rest. Is
yeah.
How that's.
Yeah. So as I say, that was previously 5%, but the block was a smaller value. So actually the value is similar to last year, even though it's 4% rather than 5% of the block this year.
Okay, so the decision for forum is to agree to 4%. Anybody got any objections? No? Okay, so we've agreed that. No hands up online.
So early years pupil premium and disability funding, access funding. From 2015, the government introduced the early years pupil premium to 3 and 4 year olds from disadvantaged backgrounds. This will be funded at £1 per hour for 25-26, an increase from the previous 68 per hour in 23-24 per eligible child per year to support better outcomes for all eligible children across all entitlements.
Yeah, so that's quite a significant one of the things that was passed through in the formula this year is quite a significant increase in the early years pupil premium funding.
So funding for Disability Access Fund on additional payment made to providers to help to make reasonable adjustments within their provision to support eligible 3 and 4 year old children in receipt of disability living allowance has increased to 938 from 900 in 24-25 per eligible child per year, and this will also be extended to all childcare offers.
So, sure, there's a reason for this. Why are they? Is there any reason why these stand for 3 and 4 year olds and not going forward for anyone below 3? No. I'm sure it's some part of some sort of national policy, but it only applies to 3 and 4 year olds.
Early years pupil premium and DAF.
Yeah, those.
Yes, so no, early years pupil premium and DAF have both been extended to all age groups, so from 9 months onwards.
Okay.
They've extended that entitlement across the piece.
That disability.
That's probably a point of clarification for the,
So yeah, point of
clarification for the minutes that it is actually across all the extended entitlements, not just for the 3 and 4 year olds now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it does say that actually.
Not as many as we would like at the moment. So the early years pupil premium is very small percentages. I mean, particularly for the DAF funding, the child has to be eligible to DLA to be able to access DAF funding. For children under the age of 2, that's quite tricky in the systems that we currently have. So yeah, it's relatively, in terms of promoting EYPP and adaptive settings, that's got to be an absolute so that we can increase those numbers.
And is the process for early years PP the same as it is for school pupil premium in terms of those-
No, so there's a different application process for early years
Okay.
pupil premium, whereas school pupil premium, reception age up, it's based on free school meal
Right.
entitlement, but there's an early years
Is it?
pupil premium
So
application.
it's a sort of
process.
different thing.
Criteria wise, it's basically the same in terms of the things that would make you eligible for it.
I'm just, the reason I'm asking is because you made a really good point about trying to increase awareness about application for it. And the same in schools, trying to get parents, because of universal entitlement now around preschool, there's a job that schools have to do to get parents who would have been previously eligible for preschool meals to register. So is it the parents aren't registering? That's why I was asking, is it a different process?
I think I think, yes, increasing parents' awareness and settings awareness, because it isn't something that we'd had available in the earlier settings to us before. It'd always been a schools thing, so it hadn't necessarily been sit within the early years agenda. So no, 100% agree that it would be, it's more about promotion and being really clear in terms of how settings access it and what the eligibility goes. Kim quite rightly said, if a child that was on the previous if a child is entitled to additional support, so therefore gets funding on the basis of that, then when they hit 3, they were always getting EYPP. So now we're going to have to pull that back. So children that are informed, families in receipt of additional support can get the EYPP at that stage. So it is about upskilling and giving providers that knowledge.
I just wanted to say that in our experience in our nursery school, our identification of those families and those children is only happening for that reach back. Now the offer has been increased to sort of 9 months plus. So we don't or haven't historically seen those children at such young ages before. So the knock-on effect of that expansion of funding for children at younger ages will hopefully feed that pipeline. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
For point 25, early years budget and allocations, all providers are funded based on participation over the entire year and not just the highest count. This ensures that funding is realistic and adjustments for over/under occupancy at the end of the year are more manageable. This will not change in line with the changes above. Moving on, in terms of contingency for 25-26, in order to ensure that the headcount changes are factored into the budget for 25-26, there is a need for a contingency. The local authority proposes that in 25-26 a budget of 1.1 mil is set aside as the contingency amount. The proposal is to hold this at the same level as the previous year to ensure adequate contingency is in place to cope with any year changes in headcount for so 25-26. We will see the final element of the roll out of the new funding entitlements, and the contingency will support managing any in-year changes in headcount, which will be critical in a year of greater expectation of change. Under the conditions of the grant, this is part of the 96% budget set to pass through to providers. Any underspend will be reported to Schools Forum, who are consulted on and approve the use of DSG reserves in the summer of year following the close of accounts, which I believe is what's been followed previously.
Okay, so I think Aretha's going to take the section on the inclusion fund, which is the last part of the earlier section.
Thank you. Okay, so the inclusion fund, local authorities are required to provide additional top-up funding to providers to improve the outcomes for children with SEND. In order to establish the SEND inclusion fund, Ealing combine both the early years block and high needs block of the DSG to meet the needs of children who have EHCPs and those who don't yet have EHCPs, so those with additional needs under SEND support. The value of inclusion fund must consider the number of children with SEND in the local area, the level of need, the overall capacity in the local childcare market that can support these children, and has created additional funding with children with emerging and less complex needs. With the new entitlements being introduced and further expanded from September 2025, a further increase in demand is expected. In 2025-26, the proposal is to carry on with the existing offer of allocating 6.19% of funding from the early years block to the inclusion fund, and the funding proposal is set out in table 5.
Could I? So did somebody else? You talked about in the first para there about supporting those with the HCPs, which is obvious. How do we deal with the ones who haven't got them? How do we identify that they are in need of the support that we're talking about having available now? Because that's a tough one for settings, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really tough because often, Louise will know, some of those children don't yet have a diagnosis and are on waiting lists and all sorts of things. So identifying and assessing those needs can be quite tricky. One of the things that we looked at, I mean, Kim mentioned the DSG management plan, and one of the things we did was really look closely at early years and early identification, because if you can get in early, the hope is that you reduce the escalation later on. And certainly my conversations with NHS colleagues have been centred around actually how do we get in at the earliest point and support providers with that early identification model and the support whilst they're waiting for that diagnosis, so that waiting well agenda for the families and the young people. So you've kind of got the holistic support going on. In terms of this particular funding, in terms of children who have the identification, we do have a team that supports settings with upskilling staff, but also working with the child and the child's needs and the child's parents to then hopefully ripple out some of that support. So you've got a good model that then can be used with other pupils. ELP also have a quality assurance, a quality and improvement strand to it for early years, and that is about going into settings. I don't know if Julie wants to come in, but that is about going into settings and supporting them to deliver high quality support, high quality teaching and learning, curriculum, all of that stuff, and that accessibility that underpins that to ensure that all pupils can access that.
Can I ask a question, Aretha, on that? In a schools forum meeting in the past, we talked about the children's centres with nurseries, like Southampton Children's Centre, having reception classes where the identified children stayed. So I've got some kind of questions on that. So we had a question before your time about how the equity of that, because if you live closer, you're more likely to get the support. So I've got a question like, are those reception classes in places like Southampton still happening? Are they funded from this 6.19%? And is there any movement on what we spoke about in the past about the equity of getting children to those based on need rather than geography?
That's a really good point, thank you. So the reception classes are being funded up until the end of this academic year. Kim will probably be able to tell you exactly which pot that comes from or at the moment. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. So it comes from the High block, if you just hear online. The conversations we've been having, particularly now Helen is really focused on that early help strategy and building on creating a system-wide support. What we want to do is create exactly what you've said, actually, a system which doesn't lie in locality, because at primary age, you're more likely to access the provision that's nearest to you or on your doorstep. You're less likely to travel across the borough to a provision that may well meet your needs, but it becomes inaccessible to you. So a lot of the conversations we've been having is about switching that to an outreach model. So things like the speech language that would go into those settings, actually how can we ripple it out and allow our therapists to travel around and support young people and children in their local area, rather than having the travel arrangements and the kind of two-tier support is, you know, if you live too far away, you miss out. We want to balance that out somewhat, and that's going to be linked really closely to the early help strategy. And so with that, we need to really think about how we can create the holistic kind of element around that. So not just the education element, but the speech and language, the early help element that will hopefully support that work to flourish.
Can I just come in here from South Acton Children's Centre and Nursery School? So the last 3 years, our reception class has been full. We've also had a transport budget to sit along with that. But the locality needs have been such that it's been filled without people travelling to us. So that gives you some indication of the need. It's not going to continue at the end of the summer term, and I suppose our big concern and the concerns that we are firefighting with parents is, so where does the next cohort go? And is it into mainstream schools? And the rippling out model that you describe, is the intention to deliver that in schools or in pupils' homes? Because the progress that these children have made, that we've tracked over the last 3 years, has been phenomenal compared to going into a mainstream school. So I think that's what we're interested to know.
Yeah, and I won't have the answer because we haven't started our consultation process. We haven't worked with colleagues to flesh out what that will look like. We're hoping to start that. I mean, I spoke to Health and we're looking at starting that straight after half term. Helen and our public health team have run a number of workshops that already that information is feeding into some of the proposals that we're looking through. So it's not a hard start. We've got some data, we've got some intelligence, and we've got some ideas already scoped out. So we're not. It's going to be continuing that work rather than restarting it. We're not looking at an outreach model that would support pupils in school at home. We want everyone to access the provision. We don't want pupils waiting at home and unable to access the correct provision. That's not one of the options that we're touting at all. I think there is scope to deliver something different and something more equitable. And whilst yours may well be full, we know that in other parts of the local authorities, those children do go into schools because they don't have the option of going elsewhere. And that, to me, needs to be fleshed out and really bottomed out in terms of what the alternative can be, so that everybody has equal access to the provision that they need in their local area.
All I would say on the timing is that once we cut that provision, there's a lead time to get it back again. So we've already given our teachers notice,
yeah.
So their contracts do not extend beyond. And to have a hard start, to start that back up again, there's a lead time to that. So if there are not those places for the children from September, that it wouldn't be easy to roll back.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah. But we'd welcome you to be part of the workshops and the provision mapping going forward. I think it's really important that you're part of the forward plan for that. So we'd welcome you to join that.
Just linked to what you were asking a moment ago. The 6.19%. How did we get to that figure, and what's the range of amount that could be taken out for the early years block? Underlying that question really is just my thinking about how much impact there may be on schools or mainstream schools coming through, and how we can mitigate maybe some of that by getting in that earlier access to services. Sorry, that's quite a technical question.
So the 6.19% is a historic amount, and so what the proposal does is to keep the same proportion of the block, so the actual cash amount increases and hopefully meets the levels of demand that you'd see from the rollout. It is broadly based on the number of places that we commission that are both specialists, allocations out to providers, so the CENIF funding for the small grant allocations that go through panel, and direct support to schools and to young people from the central team, so it broadly covers those amounts. During the conversation that we will have at the April forum, and as part of the work Aretha's described, we need to understand going forward, is what level of investment is required in that space. And that will involve consultation with all types of providers, schools forum, and that will link into budget setting for 26-27. As we've talked about at this group previously, early identification and early support is a key strand to the high needs management plan. There isn't a limit on the percentage that the inclusion fund can be. However, the mainstream funding rates need to create sustainability within the sector to make the mainstream provision available. And so there's a balance between the amount that you set aside for the inclusion fund and the direct impact that potentially has on the funding rates per child. And there are some real challenges already in the sector around kind of affordability of the provision, essentially. So I think that's probably for discussion over the course of, you know, this next period leading into consultation and setting the budget this time next year. And if there's cause and evidence to increase the level of funding, and that's what schools and providers would support, that's possible. It could be that there are different models of delivery. So I think we don't have the answers now, as Aretha said, but we want to work with you guys to plan in a more strategic way around this pot of funding going forward and make sure it's linked into the whole SEND system.
Thanks, Tamara. That's really clear. So we'll pick it up in the next meeting again.
Okay, so that's an item. So the inclusion fund and the overall sort of block rates for different groups is a sort of item for consultation rather than for a decision. So are there any further comments on the early years block and the proposed formula allocations? No. Okay, so thank you to Helen and Aretha, and then we can move on to the schools block part of the agenda. So recommendation, on the right page. Recommendation 4 is noting the value of the schools block and the budgeted commitments to the schools block. And then recommendation 5, noting and commenting on the indicative allocations of the individual schools block, which are in Appendix 1, and the proposed formula factors to be used in 25-26, which are in Appendix 2. So this section starts on page 21, section 32, paragraph 32 of the report. So colleagues remember that there are various decisions made around the schools block at the November meeting of the forum. So all the key decisions around the schools block were made at the November meeting. So the formula has been calculated on that basis. So those key decisions were around setting the minimum funding guarantee at minus 0.5%, the minimum allowable, agreeing the transfer of the 0.5% of the schools block to the high needs block. So that value has now been confirmed as 1.651 million. The agreeing growth fund rules and the uplift to reflect the increased age-weighted pupil units, and noting that for affordability purposes, final allocations may be capped or scales or formula factors adjusted. So the table 6 sets out the schools block grant allocation and the value of that. And then there's some detail around the wrapping in of the grants, so the teacher pay grant, the teacher pension grant, and the core school budget grants that were received as separate allocations in 24-25 are all wrapped into the schools block allocations. And what we've done is wrap those into the comparison figures as well. So in Appendix 1 and Appendix 2, you're able to see what the comparison with last year is with those values wrapped into the baseline. The rolling in of those grants equates to a 7.4% increase in the age-rated pupil units, a 29% increase in the free school meal value. So there's a sort of fairly significant increase from rolling in those grants, but that's funding that schools would have received as grant funding last year. So it's now part of the formula. As I say, Appendix 1 and 2 set out those indicative budgets at school level and those formula factors. So the sort of ask a forum is around commenting any comments on those. In terms of affordability, so we've discussed previously that there's a lag in the way that this, the funding comes through the schools block, which can create an affordability gap in where you've got differences between the October 23 cohorts and October 24 cohorts. In the past, we've seen quite a large affordability gap from increasing free school meal rates. That's slowed down this year, so that's less of an impact on the formula this year. But there's a sort of significant impact from the minimum funding guarantee. So at the last meeting, we agreed the minimum allowable minus 0.5%. The indicative value of the protection is £264,000. So there were 12 schools, I guess, who are protected by the minimum funding guarantee. And that's so last year it was 8 schools who were protected by it when it was 0%. Had we used 0% this year, that would have brought in been a further nearly £300,000 protection. So that was the kind of rationale that we discussed at the previous meeting in terms of the further adjustments that would have been required to all schools' budgets if we were to agree a higher minimum funding guarantee. So Ealing's funding formula continues to mirror the national funding formula as required, and it's proposed to make effectively the same adjustments as were made last year. So those adjustments to the low prior attainment deprivation factors and a small adjustment to the ORPU to manage those affordability issues. And so what that means effectively is that the increases you're seeing in the Ealing formula are the same level of increases as in the national funding formula, because we're rolling through the same adjustments as the previous year, or that's the proposal too. And that the sort of decision to continue with those adjustments rather than apply capping and scaling. We had quite a sort of in-depth conversation around that previously, but effectively it avoids disproportionately impacting those schools with the highest increases in deprivation and mobility, and also those with falling rolls, who are the schools who see the largest per pupil gains in the national funding formula. So before I move on to the growth fund part of it, are there any comments on the proposed formula factors and school level allocations? Jamie?
Maybe a pointless question, but when I've gone down Appendix 1, I count 13 schools at 0.5%, and you're saying 12 were protected.
Schools. I think it's 13 schools who were protected. I think there was one school who was around at about minus 0.5%, so didn't need protection to get back to that.
That was kind of my question. Do we need to know, is there any point in us knowing as Schools Forum how much the schools were protected by? Because obviously these guys are like bottoming out at minus 0.5, but one of them could have potentially been minus 3.8 and one of them could have been minus 25 for all we know. Do we need that level of intelligence in any way? Do you need it in any way? I
mean, we know it, I don't know off the top of my head, but we do have that level of detail in terms of the underlying data. So what the protection is, as I say, the total protection as a value was, what did I say? It was 264,000. So some of those schools, it's a small amount of protection. I think the largest, I'm going to say something like 80 or 90,000, something like that. So there are some schools who are protected to a bigger extent within that. I can hunt out and provide that information if helpful, but yes, it does vary a little bit.
I'm not like saying that I don't think we need it to discuss it, but I'm just wondering whether it's important for those schools to know that they were heavily protected because something might affect them in the future, or they might always hit the floor in the coming 5 years and need to know that. Like, is there any intelligence around that that's important for the schools that were protected a lot, or actually is it irrelevant because they're always just going to sit at the floor value?
I think you're probably right. I think it is probably helpful for them to know. It's not all the same schools as last year. So there are some schools who've been protected for a few years. We did go down to the stage of only having one school protected a couple of years ago when there were larger increases in the formula between years. As I say, that's increased back up because those wrapping in of grants is included effectively in the baseline. The actual increase in the per pupil value that schools have seen is smaller, and therefore where you get the changes in characteristics, there are more schools who are falling below that value, which is why the kind of increase to 12 schools. But yeah, I take the point. I can't remember if it's on what's shared with the schools, but I think it probably would be helpful for them to know.
Yeah. So schools do receive that information, but they probably wouldn't be alert to what that meant. The cash value between years is essentially marginal, because either the funding formula changes because the demographics have bumped them up again, or the MFG will kick in. So the actual cash value to them between years is marginal. Where it was really significant, we did have direct conversations with those schools, but we can pick that up and make sure that those schools are clear about it where it's a larger amount.
Okay, if I move on to recommendation, where am I? 6, which is to note the external growth fund estimates and proposed approach to funding, and agree an in-principle approach to using 24-25 reserves to partially fund the growth fund pressures. So this is section, it's picked up from point 41 of the report on page 22. So the final growth fund allocation we received within the schools block formula was 1.4 million, and that was inclusive of both growth and falling roll allocations within the formula. So just over £1 million of that related to growth and 300,000 of it related to falling rolls in some area. But what we've done is sort of combine those as part of the growth fund. A significant proportion of that goes to fund what they call implicit growth, which is basically the growing through the year groups of ARC Zone, which are the most recent school to open and still have a year group that needs funding as they fill to the top. This is the last year that that will be a requirement through the formula, which will actually reduce the pressure on the formula, because the way it works, the amount we get in isn't as much as the amount we have to pass back out for implicit growth. The explicit growth estimate is 1.1 million, and the proposal is to fund that through the formula as far as is possible, with the same adjustments as we've made in previous years, which is 734,000 funded through the formula, and to fund the remaining 400,000 of the estimate through the reserves. Jamie?
Sorry.
Right.
Just for clarity, you say it's the last year. Is that because the school will then be full to year 11, or is that because the government have said we're not going to fund implicit growth anymore?
No, it's because they'll be then full to year 11, so they will receive the funding for the pupils being on roll through the.
So if we had a new school in the future that was growing, implicit growth fund would occur again in the future.
Yeah.
Okay. Boo. Thank you.
And as I say, so that's the kind of continuation of the approach in previous years, and avoids the need to further top slice the schools block allocations. And it's slightly less than the amount of external growth due to be funded through reserves this year. So what will happen is the outturn positions will be reported to Forum in the June meeting, and at that meeting there's an agreement around the where there are reserves on the block. So the expectation is that there will continue to be a small surplus on the early years and schools blocks around the unused contingency. So we're asking that Forum members agree the sort of principle of continuing to allow those reserves to meet growth fund pressures ahead of a final decision in June once the outturn positions are known. Is there any comments or thoughts on that? No? Okay. Then just moving through a report, there's a little bit of information about the funding outside of the formula. We're not anticipating at this stage that there'll be any additional core school budget grants or supplementary grants or mainstream funding grants or whatever they're going to call any additional grant. There's no indication from the sort of recommendations, government recommendations for the teacher pay awards, that there would be any additional funding at this stage. Obviously, if those teacher pay awards end up being higher, that could kick in again, but the sort of indication at the moment is that there won't be any additional funding announced. The thing that there is additional funding for this year outside of the formula is the national insurance increase. So the employer's contribution to the national insurance, they've confirmed that there will be additional funding outside the formula for that, but not yet confirmed how that will work. But it's likely to be similar to the sort of grant allocations that we've seen around teacher pay and pensions, where there's a kind of per pupil element to it, a lump sum and some additional element targeted at the free school meal children to kind of pick up the higher staffing ratios. So that's we expect to hear further information on that, but yeah, that's the expectation.
Does that cover non-maintained as well, the national insurance support, because if it doesn't, their costs will go up presumably, but they will not necessarily be funded at a higher level.
So that covers state-funded providers, so schools, but it doesn't cover. I don't believe it covers PVI providers.
But they are profit making.
But they won't be if they can't be paid at a rate that pays their staff. I mean, I have no vested interest, by the way. I'm not doing it for it. I'm just asking it just for clarity, really. So yeah, it is only.
Yeah, so that funding that's been announced today is for state-funded providers. So yeah, it's a central pressure.
Kim, sorry, could I just check one thing? With the teacher pay and pensions grant getting rolled into the schools block, how will that affect special schools and PRU's budgets?
Yeah, so for special schools and PRU's, there will still be a separate grant. So in the last like this current year, there were 3 different grants. There was a teacher pay grant, there was a teacher pension grant, and there was a core school budget grant. What's happening for special schools and PRU's is that it's being wrapped together into one grant. So there's, I think, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but it's basically wrapping in the values for those 3 grants for last year, plus an uplift to the core school budget grant to make it a full year effect, and that will continue through to into 25-26, in addition to baselines and top-ups funding for those schools. So, and just the final bits on the kind of schools block, the final values for the education functions and de-delegated services are set out on page 24. So the decisions around those were made at the November meeting, but we've now got the final pupil numbers, which are marginally different from the values set out in the November report. So those are the final values set out in tables 7 and 8 of the reports. Okay. So if I move on to the essentially retained, so central school services block, so recommendation, where are we, 7, is to note the revised central school services block allocation and agree the proposed adjustments to the line-by-line allocations. So the final grant value for the central school services block has been confirmed as 2.26 million, which is 159,000 higher than the anticipated block total that Forum agreed the line-by-line allocation of in November. So we need to effectively agree to allocate out that additional funding against the lines. So the local authority proposal is that we allocate the additional funding in 3 different areas. So 36,000 of it to ensure that the anticipated increase in copyright licenses charges is fully covered. So that's not actually something that Forum need to vote on that line. The copyright license, that's something we need to fund. So what we want to make sure is that the allocation is sufficient to cover that. So that's based on the cost this year with a plus 4% to give some room for that to increase. 30,000 to the asset management. So we've seen additional costs in that area related to capital programme management and landlord responsibilities in relation to the creation of additional specialist places. So for allocating a further 30,000 to that area to help meet with those costs, and the remaining 93,000 to the statutory and regulatory duties line, which is sort of the largest line of the retained duties area. So allocating the remaining to that line to cover the range of things that are within that statutory and regulatory duties line. So those final proposed allocations are in table 9, and we just need to have a vote on agreeing those allocations.
Anybody got any comments or questions with regards to those allocations? No? So we'll agree those 3. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, so if we move on to the high needs block. So the recommendations around the high needs block are to note the value of the high needs block in the budgeted commitments, and then to note that officers will report further on the SEND strategy and the DSG management plan at the next meeting of the forum. So the high needs section starts on page 26 of the report, paragraph 56. So the government have confirmed the high needs allocation, and table 10 sets out those comparisons. So the initial net growth is confirmed as 4.692 million, which represents a 6% increase compared to the high needs block funding received in 24-25. So the increase is higher than previously anticipated. So you may remember the government announced an additional £1 billion worth of funding for high needs. So that's what that increase is coming in, is that. So part of it increases the high needs block, and part of it goes to fund the full year effect of the core school budget grant for special schools and PRUs that we just mentioned previously. So we are seeing that increase. It is higher than anticipated, but you'll know that the pressures we're seeing in the high needs block, as we've discussed previously, the increased costs, the increased level of demand, which is around the 10% mark again for this year. So it goes some way towards that increasing demand, but not fully, unfortunately.
So thinking back to what we looked at before about how much of that is going to be affected by pupil numbers and how much is going to be funding per pupil, are schools likely to find that because they've got more pupils falling in the category that gets funded by high needs, that they're actually getting less per pupil because this doesn't go far enough to cover the 10% of increase, I think you're saying, in pupils? That I'm just wondering how you square the circle, as it were.
By
So it's
going
not-
into deficit.
it's essentially, we have to put the provision in place that's in the plan and pay providers to deliver that. It does influence decision making around kind of broader funding arrangements. We have a project running at the moment around descriptor levels to determine top-ups. We are collectively responsible for working towards a sustainable high needs budget, and that's what the deficit management plan, or the DSG management plan, works towards. But ultimately, it's a deficit on the high needs block that escalates if we continue to respond as we have done historically, because demand will just continue to increase and costs will increase. So there's a broader, what you'll see in April is a broader plan around sufficiency of provision, both specialist provision, support to mainstream providers, and work towards looking at the funding model in mainstream provision. We've already completed some work which needs a refresh in the specialist provision. So top-ups aren't dictated by the total money available. It's dictated by need and what we're committed to in plans, but we need to be working towards aligning the two. Yeah, we're not legally, we can't set a deficit budget. So the first call on next year's budget is always the previous year's deficit. But our management plan has to take us into a balanced budget in year going forward and repaying the deficit. And so that's what the management plan currently aims to deliver. And obviously there are various ambitions around both demand and cost to deliver that, which are ambitious essentially, and will require a collective effort across all providers and the LA and partner organisations like Health.
That sounds as though you could be saying the current level of descriptor funding is going to be less in the future because you haven't got the money to fund it. And I think most of the schools who are reliant on those numerous descriptors are not finding that they've got lots of surplus money left.
So that's absolutely not what I'm saying.
Okay,
we have to fund the provision to meet need. What we described in the early years section is that early help, early identification, you'd hope that needs would be met at an earlier stage and the level of provision required later on would be managed in some cases. And so it's the balance between having the right provision available at the right time to manage need. And so that's what the deficit management plan is focused on. But the reality is that there's a national challenge. There's a national challenge around funding, And so you can only manage a deficit through managing cost and managing demand. And so you can read into that what you will, but it requires a SEND strategy, which is ambitious, and a management plan, which is ambitious, and requires all of our buy-in to deliver that.
There are protections within the same way there's a minimum funding guarantee for mainstream schools within the schools block funding formula. There is a minimum funding guarantee for special schools within the high needs block formula. At the moment, that's a 0% minimum funding guarantee. So there is the sort of protection around funding levels comes from having a minimum funding guarantee in the formula.
It's like we don't need as many EHCPs to be issued.
So I didn't say limit demand because that's artificial. If you're managing demand, you're meeting need, and you may not need an EHCP in all instances. And so part of the management plan will be around what provision is available without a plan, and potentially more provision being available than currently available without a plan. Demand is driven.
I can see trouble ahead here, tribunals galore. But
I
yeah,
don't know if you want
I
to
get
come
it
in,
from
Rita.
I think it's really tricky nationally, isn't it? And to say otherwise would be disingenuous. I think we're not. No, haven't seen. There might be a local authority out there that has this magic wand and this magic pot of money tray that we can lean on and get some ideas and kind of share good practice. But I think where we're at now, with a real realistic lens on, is that we don't have enough early identification, enough provision early on. And so what we've seen is quite a rapid rise. And I'm not saying it's not driven by need, it absolutely is, but quite a rapid rise in EHCP applications, because unless you do that, you don't get the support. And what we're trying to do is say, actually, there are some cases where actually you can, if we have a better system early on, you don't then need to escalate it to the plan. But to get that balance is going to be really, really tricky. I'm not going to sit here and sugarcoat it at all. It's going to be really, really tricky, and there will be some contentious issues that we need to iron out. But it is the collective responsibility to do this. Otherwise, we end up in a situation where there is no. You can have a plan, that's absolutely great, but you might not get the resources and everything to meet that plan. And at the other end, there are cases where plans go on for too long. Like if you put the right intervention at the right time in place and it's really impactful, plans don't need to be up until post 1625. Actually, there's stuff we can do differently at that end. So looking at early years is one part of it, but also looking at actually as children and young people develop and grow and move on into post 16 education and beyond, what does that actually look like? So you're talking about the offers, the course, employability, all of that comes into that element. But to do those two things really well, we need to invest. And so we need to look at tipping the balance, and that's it's going to be contentious and it's going to be tricky, but we're going to have to find a way through. Otherwise, we're never going to rebalance and redress the system.
I don't dispute that all those things have to happen. It's just the time scales of getting from where we are to where we need to be in a very relatively short time. We're talking initially a 12-month window, aren't we? That we're trying to do things a bit differently, and that's a lot to deliver in that time scale.
Yeah, the DSG management plan's a bit longer than that. So it goes up to, so initially we've looked up to 2031, I think. And it's not an off the cliff edge plan. It's a tailoring plan. But when it comes here, you'll see it in more detail when we'll be able to kind of flesh through some of the points that I'm sure will be raised, and I'll try and prep as much as I can for.
Okay, so any other comments on the high needs block? No. Okay, so we'll come back to a more detailed discussion at the April meeting of the forum. So the final bits are around school balances. So firstly, around noting an update on forecasted school balances. So all maintained schools were asked to make a budget monitoring return at the end of November, so a mid-year point budget monitoring return. 11 of the schools were forecasting that they'll be in deficit at the end of 24-25. So it's 12 for the moment for the current financial year. So 6 primary schools, 1 special school, and 4 nursery schools. There's actually a high school who subsequently submitted their data and are as well. So 3 of these nursery schools were previously in surplus, although there's been their forecasted positions have improved subsequently to their return following some confirmation around back pay and grant income. 2 schools are forecasting reduced deficit, 6 are forecasting increasing deficits. 4 schools previously in deficit are forecasting they'll move from a deficit into a surplus. So there are some positive bits in there, but there are also some schools who are falling into deficit who weren't previously, and some schools whose deficits are increasing. So we're working closely with those schools around deficit recovery planning. In terms of overall school balances, so just over half of those schools with a surplus balance are forecasting those balances will have reduced. So there are the remaining schools who are forecasting an increase in their balances. Total forecasted balances for maintained schools are 12.1 million. So a further reduction of around 2.2 million from the position at the end of 23-24, but still a fairly sizable amount in school balances in the forecast. So any comments on that bit, John?
Just reading into that, then, yeah, if the amount that is being lost for some schools, their balances are going down quite significantly, I presume. If it's reducing by 2.2 million in total, the increases are pretty minor.
Yeah, so some schools are seeing quite significant decreases this year, and as I say, there are some schools who are moving into a deficit position within that. There are, say, nearly half of schools whose are increasing, but a lot of those that is fairly marginal. Yeah. Okay, and then just on the final point, so this is something we started to pick up at the previous meeting. So note an update on the implementation of the 23-24 balance control mechanism and provide further feedback around potential changes to the mechanism. So at the July meeting, forum members asked the local authority to implement the 23-24 balance control mechanism. That's now been implemented, and there were 4 schools on the sort of initial list who are potentially in scope and following calculations and taking into account the balance forms and representation of the school. The clawback was taken forward with 1 school with a value of £3,000, so fairly small value for the balance control mechanism this year. At the request of forum members, officers sought the views of schools in the funding consultation about whether schools supported changing the mechanism to claw back a greater proportion. So the 2 kind of areas that could potentially be changed are around either the incremental values upon which the clawback is applied, or around the condition for balances to be excessive and increasing over 2 consecutive years. There was fairly limited feedback through the consultation and no kind of overall consensus. So we discussed it in the November forum briefly and agreed that forum members would have further discussions in their networks in preparation for a further discussion at either this meeting or the April meeting. I know we're sort of fairly early in January and those network meetings probably haven't taken place yet. So yeah, it's just to kind of pick up that conversation and any feedback on that, and then agree kind of direction of travel in terms of that.
I think the problem with this is that you can find yourself in the same position in the April meeting. I don't know if colleagues think that there will be fruitful discussions in the network meetings about the balance control mechanism, because it requires a kind of level of technical knowledge. It's kind of up to you guys. I suppose if there was some sort of summary communication as to what a couple of possibilities are, and then people could give feedback on those couple of options, that would. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I don't know if anybody's got any views on that.
Yeah, I think we were just saying the same. We need a standardised question at least, don't we, that we're going to be asking in those networks that we've agreed.
Okay, so that probably would make the decision on this easier in April then. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. I don't think we'll necessarily, if we have those discussions, we won't necessarily come to an agreement but at least the point is that if we've got a centralised question and we have the discussion, then people are aware that this may be changing and these are our options and the decision will be made here.
Yeah, I mean, we don't necessarily have to make it. So what we were proposing was a potential change for the following financial year, but giving schools the kind of notice of that. So we don't necessarily have to make a decision around a change in April, but an actual decision could wait until sort of June, once we have the closing balances and the illustration of what the balance control mechanism looks for these closing balances. So obviously there's then less notice. The later you kind of make any decision around the changing, there's less notice in terms of the implications for that for schools. But yeah, I think it would just be helpful to get some more kind of feedback from the networks as to the range of views
I think one of
Can I?
So,
Oh, sorry. Is that right? Thanks, David. Ian. Is it worth putting time and money into thinking about this, bearing in mind that it made the LA just over £3,000, and in the accountancy team time, it probably cost £3,000 worth of accountancy team time to claw that back. And I think we should have a balance control thing to stop like a rogue school having 200%, reserves or something. But I'm wondering whether we even bother, and actually whether our time is much better spent talking about things like SEND that are really, really contentious and important, because actually this balance control mechanism, we're operating this -0.5% thingy, like floor. More schools are falling into it. Everyone says they're going to be bust in 3 years anyway. Is it likely that you're going to claw back any money next year, or is it going to be another £3,000? Is it even worth bothering to do, bearing in mind the amount you get back? You might as well get your accountancy team spending their time doing other stuff, because it's not actually earning us any money doing this. And the deterrent sits there, which is good, but is it worth us wasting our time on it, because it's probably not going to make us any money anyway?
So I wonder on that basis if, Kim's suggested it could come back in June, you'll actually see the balances of schools and how the variability across, rather than it coming in April, where we probably will need to spend a considerable amount of time discussing the DHG management plan. So if we, instead of the recommendation that's in this, which essentially is come back in April forum, we come back in June, and schools can take a view at that stage in light of what has actually emerged, because often the in-year forecasts of schools are relatively prudent, and actually the outturn position is somewhat better, and so it'd be challenging to make a decision on that based on that in-year return, I think. So maybe if we come back in June and you can take a view, we can give a couple of examples. I think the previous feedback from Forum is that potentially the clawback should be higher, and that's what the consultation was on, but you'd hope that would be on a smaller number of schools. So I think it has had the impact in terms of focusing some schools' minds on planning to spend their balances in a bit of a different way to what they had been doing in the past. Some Forum colleagues won't have been on Forum at the time, but there was a point in time where the surpluses across schools were 30 million. So broader national context clearly has had an impact on that, but also kind of focus on not storing up funding for a rainy day has also, that mindset has shifted a bit with schools and spending the money on the children while they're there.
Yeah, I definitely think we should keep a balance control mechanism. I just think, is there any point talking about changing it, bearing in mind it doesn't tend to do much, and it might not, because every school's got less money next year type thing.
So now is probably not the time. I mean, I've been a fairly keen supporter of this, because we have seen large balances, but the current economic climate for schools is not one that makes you think. But it's really important, and we always said we weren't trying to penalise ones. We wanted them to spend the money really sensibly and currently, and not keep it for another 2 or 3 years down the line. I think we've achieved quite a lot of that, and so if we can go with staking for now and reviewing it in June, as you say.
Thanks, Ian. Robert, do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's very sensible to review in June, but the point I wanted to make is that I remember the first forum I attended in April 2023, and the forum was quite exercised about this matter at that point in time, and because it may have been just how some of the numbers were looking at that point in time. So I support the June point, but I think it's really important to keep it on the agenda, have that active kind of look here and really engage schools in the debate as well. Because I think in some ways, the fact that budgets might tighten might become more important, because it then starts to inform wider strategies in terms of place planning as well. So I just think, important for that. I just remember that meeting very well. We were sat,
Good
we were sat
introduction.
up on high, Paul. Yes.
I think, sorry, Paul, can I just say, I think it's important to remember that the purpose of having the balance control mechanism is not to make money, it's to encourage schools to spend the money on the children, exactly as you said. And given, in my school anyway, that we need every single penny a lot of the time to support our children with additional needs, boggles my mind how you could have any spare money. So I think my thought is, if you've got spare money and thinking maybe your provision is not as good as it should be or as inclusive as it should be. So I think increasing the balance control mechanism would make schools spend the money on the children that are there.
Thanks, everybody. So just, Isabel, just for the purposes of the minutes, we'll come back to it in June.
Could you want something on?
For the balance
No, I think
control,
discussion,
June.
Okay.
One more point? No. Thank you, Kim, for taking us through the school forum report. There's only a couple of things left, and one of them is the delightful election of the next chair. So the nominations that we've had so far are Jeremy Hannay from Three Bridges. Is everyone happy to agree Jeremy as the next chair? Yeah. Okay, so he's duly chosen.
Thumbs up online.
Okay. I just want to close the meeting by saying thank you to all my colleagues in School Forum. It's been a privilege to serve as the chair. It really is a very important committee and forum. And over a course of a few years, I've really been inspired how collaborative forum has become. It's no easy task, and there are significant challenges discussing these issues, but there is a collective will, and I would just say, going forward, to really build on that collective will to make the lives of the children in our schools and our provisions the best possible. I also do want to say a heartfelt thanks to the officers, particularly to Kim and Tamara, and to their colleagues for absolutely splendid work they do in keeping us afloat. It's no easy task, and they're challenged on a number of fronts. But I think we'd all agree we're very lucky to have them as lead officers to do such sterling work for all of us. So on that note, good luck, good night, and I'll see you sometime soon.
If I can just add my 2 pence before trying to get out. That's a quick step there, Paul. Paul, your contribution to this forum has been immense. You used the word collaboration, and I think what you really do illustrate and personify is that word. And we are incredibly grateful. We really do want to celebrate, just highlight how fantastic your contribution has been. And, some people can collaborate in a way that makes everything easy and dodges some of the challenging, tough questions. But you've always been happy to look at those challenges, to push hard, to do that in a way without a great deal of threat. the threat is left aside, but you know the challenge is there, and is put in a friendly, collaborative way, and in a way which is how you've led your school. You know, it's about looking at what's in the best interest of the children, as you were saying before, Emma. So, you know, I really do appreciate that from the bottom of my heart, really, because it's huge. You know, that commitment put out there. I don't know how long you've been here in the borough. I was saying to Julie before that I don't know if we need some carbon dating or cutting through the ice cap to see. I won't ask you to tell us just. Okay, so it's a huge commitment, but you know, thank you, and we're looking forward, Julie, myself, and other colleagues, to celebrating with you as we move towards the point when you will move on to new opportunities and are making a great contribution in other ways. So thank you so much, Paul. Well done.